In this series, we're going to talk about power, specifically political power as manifested by the state. We're going to look at the forms this power takes and try to choose appropriate metrics to determine its extent at any given time and place. And then we'll trace the development of the state through history. It's very important to do this, especially if, like myself, you live in America. That's because a lot of the history we use to explain ourselves to ourselves is much too flattering and convenient to be true. Among other things, we'll call into question the idea that revolutions bring liberty. The flag you see in front of you is from the French Revolution. It says Tremble Tyrants, and the not-so-subtle message is that the French Revolution represented the overthrow of tyranny in favor of the principle of liberty. Now that was the idea, the aspiration. The question is, what was the result? Did liberty win? The revolutionaries won. But it's important to remember that just because you win a war, it does not automatically follow that you got what you wanted. Victory might mean realizing your ideal. It might also mean sacrificing it. And in wars fought for liberty, liberty is often the first casualty. We miss that because we tend to assume that the victory of one side is equivalent to the realization of the ideals that side fought for. This is simply not true. And to understand this, we can look at how modern elections, which resemble wars, usually work. The victory of a particular candidate, for example, does not automatically result in the realization of everything that candidate promised or believed in. Usually the candidate sacrifices most of whatever it was he stood for just to obtain the victory. And even if he doesn't sacrifice his ideals on his way to office, he may well forget them once he's there. Revolutions work in the same way, but we don't want to admit it. For example, when we're talking about the American Revolution, we simply take it for granted that a tyrannical regime was cast off and a new age of liberty was established, the fruits of which we are reaping today. We can then pat ourselves on the back for being the freest people who ever lived. We assure ourselves that we have not only achieved the ideal of liberty, but that we have become that ideal, and that if the rest of the world would only follow our example, shaping itself in our image, the world would be a much better place. As I said earlier, this is a very flattering and comfortable narrative, but for that very reason it should strike us as suspicious. Is it historical? As a history of ideals and aspirations, yes. The revolutionaries did aspire to liberty and happiness and the betterment of the human condition. And yes, Americans today still do aspire to be the greatest, freest nation on earth. So as a history of good intentions, sure, but that's not what we're interested in. What we want to know is, behind all the sentimental rhetoric about human dignity and the rights of man, what actually happened to man? What actually happened to liberty? Or, more relevant to this presentation, when all the bodies were buried, had tyranny really been driven from Western civilization? These are the questions I'm going to try to answer, and there's a lot of information here, so just fair warning, I'm going to try to move quickly. Let's start by stating our central argument, borrowing a few words from Bertrand de Juvenal, who said in his work On Power, "From the 12th to the 18th century, government authority grew continuously. The process was understood by all who saw it happening. It stirred them to incessant protest and to violent reaction. In later times, its growth has continued at an accelerated pace. And now we no longer understand the process, we no longer protest, we no longer react. This quiescence of ours is a new thing for which power has to thank the smokescreen in which it has wrapped itself. Formerly it could be seen, manifest in the person of the king, who did not disclaim being the master he was. Now, masked in anonymity, it claims to have no existence of its own and to be but the impersonal and passionless instrument of the general will." So, what is power? The answer for us is government authority. There are other points of view and kinds of power, economic power, military power, or technological power, and we'll deal with these as necessary, but our emphasis is the growth and development of the state. So the next question is, how do we measure this kind of power? Well, we can put it in mathematical terms by saying that the resources at power's disposal divided by the resources inherent in society is equal to the total extent of power. The advantage of looking at power in this way is that it allows us to avoid the deception of forms. I'm talking about political forms like monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy, and also economic forms like capitalism, socialism, feudalism. These are all social forms and they are all connected with power, but they do not determine power or its extent. What this means is that it is not legitimate to assume that we know the extent of power simply by looking at the form of government and nothing else. Power isn't dictated by form. The power exercised by a king might be far less extensive than the power exercised by a modern president. Once we set aside our prejudices regarding form, we can begin to see other, more accurate means of determining the extent of power. War, for example, is another expression of power that we'll trace throughout this presentation. The extent of war is directly connected to the extent of power, and total war is not possible for any but a totalitarian government, since by definition it requires that all of a society's resources be at power's disposal. That's why Omer Talon said that war is a monster whom there is a conspiracy not to throttle, so that it may continue always as the opportunity of those who abuse the royal authority. James Madison had a similar warning, saying that in time of actual war, great discretionary powers are constantly given to the executive magistrate. Constant apprehension of war has the same tendency to render the head too large for the body. Now, the equation I have given is accurate but general. In order to really make use of it, we need to choose certain observable and quantifiable aspects of power to which we can apply it. And so, in addition to war, I'm going to focus on several other expressions of power that are easily traced throughout history: taxation, conscription, and law. Taxation and conscription are useful because they are two kinds of resources that can be plugged into our equation in order to measure power for a given regime. Our equation deals with resources. Taxation represents control over the economic resources of a society. Conscription, on the other hand, which is just another word for the draft, allows nations to compel citizens to serve in wars, which allows power to command vast armies, and so it represents control over human resources. I'll also be looking at legislation, since it is another very direct expression of power, and a society's ideas about law will go through distinct phases as power succeeds in extending its reach. We'll look at who makes the law, within what limits, and by what measure is justice determined. I've just described the approach I'll be taking throughout the rest of this presentation. In the next video, I'll start the historical overview, which begins at the fall of the Roman Empire and ends in the present. If you want to be notified when that happens, just subscribe to this channel.